Hey, well met, travelers. Thanks for stopping by. You are about to watch a video proving that the racially diverse casting of the Rings of Power is 100% faithful to Tolkien's lore, and that everyone on YouTube telling you otherwise is just lying to you. Stay tuned. Rings of Power dropped its Season 1 finale a little over a year ago and is returning to Amazon Prime this year for Season 2, which means we can expect a lot more insightful Tolkien fan commentary like this.
Guess what is getting into Rings of Power? Their own personal politics. They're pushing all of this identity politics nonsense into this show when it doesn't belong. And people are like, oh, well, just look at Lord of the Rings. It's all about, all these different races coming together and it's about diversity and all this stuff. Yes, those races are the diversity. You don't need to add black people into that.
Now that's Tarmiriel according to Amazon Prime, but the professor described her a little differently. More fair than ivory, pearls, or silver. That's the description Tolkien wrote for us to live through his imagination.
The Queen of Numenor, Tarmiriel. And I would like to point out that this is actually the art of Tarmiriel from before we had the Rings of Power. And now we've got the Rings of Power, art, Rings of Power, the fans, power, fans, Amazon, fans.
During Season 1, that was the kind of thing that passed for fan commentary about the show here on YouTube. It's the fan content that gets the most clicks and dominates the algorithm. It's also dumb and racist. Now, it's not that the Rings of Power is or should be above criticism, far from it. But this kind of thing projects a lot of unconscious assumptions into Tolkien that are not terribly flattering for the person doing the projecting. And what's more, it ignores both the text of the show and the very Tolkien lore it claims to be defending. And since this kind of Rings of Power content is almost certainly going to be dominating the algorithm during Season 2, I figure it's as good a place as any to start my channel's relaunch. The underlying claim here, that Rings of Power is too woke because it's forcing modern ideas about racial diversity into a story world where it has no place, really needs to be dismantled and debunked, because it is nonsense all the way down. So I'm going to use this video to show how the racially diverse casting of Rings of Power actually makes perfect sense within Tolkien's lore, and that any other hypothetical Tolkien adaptation set in the times and places that Rings of Power is would have to make the same kinds of casting choices if it wanted to maintain fidelity to Tolkien's lore. Hopefully, this will give fellow fans of the show more confidence in advocating for it against stupid and racist fake critiques like the ones I just showed you, and maybe help create a counter-narrative to resist YouTube's algorithmic bias towards negative and hateful content. So let's start with a primer on how Tolkien himself handled the distribution of ethnicities in his world building. Middle-earth is meant to function as a facsimile of our own world, in terms of the ways that human ethnicity interacts with geography. This means that the farther south or east one travels from the Shire, which is intended to stand in for England, the darker the skin tones of the settled human populations tend to be. Eventually, this takes us into lands like Near Harad, whose armies filled much of the ranks of Sauron's forces during the War of the Ring. The Haradrim, the people of this land, are described in the Two Towers novel as being brown-skinned with black hair and dark eyes. They are meant to more or less represent the lands and peoples of the Middle East and North Africa, which inspired their costume designs in Peter Jackson's movie trilogy. Also farther east and south, we find lands like Khand and Rhûn, which also functioned in Tolkien's work as stand-ins for places like the Indian subcontinent and the central steppelands of Eurasia, respectively. Rhûn lay to the east of Mordor and, like Harad, provided vast numbers to Sauron's armies in the Third Age. Khamûl, one of the 9 kings of men who became ring-wraiths, had been a king of Rhûn in the Second Age. He was the Ringwraith who pursued the hobbits to Buckleberry Ferry in Book 1, Chapter 4 of the Fellowship of the Ring. And based on where Nori's and the Strangers' plot ended in Season 1, we may be meeting some Runish characters in Season 2, possibly even Khamûl himself. Khand was south of Rhûn and east of Harad, making it a geographic analog of northwest India and bordering lands like Afghanistan. And like Rhûn, its people allied with Mordor in the Third Age, supplying horses to Sauron's armies. In the novel version of The Return of the King, a Khandian force known as the Variags fought alongside the Morgul host against Gondor at the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. Now this alliance of dark-skinned nations with the Dark Lord Sauron in The Lord of the Rings has opened Tolkien's work up to accusations of racism from some quarters, which I won't get into here. But politically and geographically, within the context of their own world, these alliances do make some geopolitical sense. Bordering Mordor on the east and south as they do, they would fall under its direct sphere of influence, especially since, unlike Gondor and Rohan, there is no largely impassable mountain range separating them from Sauron, and thus it would be in their cynical political interests to ally with Mordor, quite apart from questions of good or evil. And speaking of that mountain range, it served as a natural fortress and a logical border with Gondor and Rohan. But there were passes through the mountains which could have facilitated trade between east and west, north and south, in earlier days. Which brings us to The Rings of Power, Season 1. A significant portion of this season's story takes place in Mordor before it was Mordor, and known simply as the Southlands. In The Rings of Power, this was a time early in the Second Age when future Mordor was not yet a volcanic wasteland under the dominion of a supernatural Dark Lord and his legions of orcs, when it was just a normal-ass country. And this normal-ass country bordered the lands of Harad, Khand, and Rhûn on the south and east, and the future lands of Gondor and Rohan on the west, and almost certainly had trade routes running to and from all of them. In other words, it would have been a cultural crossroads where people from all parts of Middle-earth mingled for trade and diplomacy. Some of those people from the varied lands would have settled there permanently as well. Thus, we would expect the Southlands to have an ethnically diverse, settled human population, and this is exactly what we see in The Rings of Power. The background cast and featured extras are a cross-section of human ethnicities, and the two main human-speaking roles, Bronwyn and her son Theo, are played by actors with a mixed racial heritage. Nazanin Baniadi, who plays Bronwyn, is of British and Iranian descent, while Tyro Muhaffedin, who plays Theo, is of Australian and Indonesian descent. Speaking of Gondor and Rohan, they were not always Gondor and Rohan. Those nations were founded in the Second Age by Numenorian settlers who conquered and colonized them, displacing the indigenous population. That indigenous population, known by the Third Age as the Dunlendings, held on to resentment over their conquest for generations, and that lingering resentment was exploited by the wizard Saruman, who used it to lure the Dunlendings to his side in the service of Sauron in The Lord of the Rings. The Dunlendings were explicitly described by Tolkien as swarthy, or dark-skinned, in Appendix F of The Lord of the Rings titled The Languages and Peoples of the Third Age. And we know from his notes that their ancestors inhabited the foothills and vales from the Misty Mountains all the way to the White Mountains, and the lands that would one day become Gondor and Rohan. This means that during the Second Age, before the foundings of Gondor and Rohan, when Season 1 of The Rings of Power takes place, large parts of the mainland of Middle-earth were populated by dark-skinned humans, further adding to the ethnic diversity of the region around the Southlands. Now, all of this is right there in Tolkien's own maps and histories. It kind of makes you wonder whether any of the channels I showed you earlier have actually read them. Future Mordor is not the only nation of men that serves as a setting for the Rings of Power, though. We also get an extensive look at the island nation of Numenor, one of the most popular and consequential elements of Tolkien's lore. And, here again, racial diversity in casting is not just consistent with the legendarium, but may actually be required by it, assuming fidelity to the lore is what you care about. The men of Numenor were largely descended from two noble houses among the Edain, who came to Beleriand from the Far East during the First Age. They had to flee that land at the end of the War of Wrath, when Beleriand sank into the sea. The Valar gave these surviving men the island of Numenor, and it became their home. One of the two houses of men who made up the original Numenorians and settled largely on the western part of the island was House Beorn, who are given the following description by Tolkien in The Peoples of Middle-earth. Quote, "There were fair-haired men and women among the folk of Beorn, but most of them had brown hair, going usually with brown eyes, and many were less fair in skin, some indeed being swarthy." Unquote. Swarthy, remember, is a word that means dark-skinned. Incidentally, in the final days of Numenor, House Beorn made up a majority of the Faithful, the faction who remained friendly with and loyal to the ways of the elves. Their most famous members were Elendil and his sons Anarion and Isildur, the ancestors of Aragorn. Tolkien put a lot of thought into all aspects of his world design and constantly drew parallels between the cultures and peoples he invented and real-world cultures and peoples. And unlike most of the lands that play a central role in The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien modeled Numenor not on any European example, but on ancient Egypt. In a 1958 letter to Rona Bear, he wrote, quote, "The Numenorians of Gondor were proud, peculiar, and archaic, and I think are best pictured in, say, Egyptian terms. In many ways, they resembled Egyptians, the love of and power to construct the gigantic and massive, and in their great interest in ancestry and tombs. I think the crown of Gondor, the southern kingdom, was very tall, like that of Egypt, but with wings attached, not set straight back but at an angle. The northern kingdom had only a diadem, the difference between the northern and southern kingdoms of Egypt." Unquote. While it is true that Tolkien says nothing about Numenorian skin color in that passage, we have already seen that at least some members of Numenor's ruling class were, canonically, dark-skinned, and that fits well with the Egyptian motif that he had in mind. So, once again, the casting choices Rings of Power made for the Numenorians are consistent with Tolkien's legendarium. Any other hypothetical adaptation about the Second Age would have to make similar casting decisions if it wanted to remain true to Tolkien's Numenor. In addition, we can also make some plausible extrapolations about Numenorian society that further strengthen the case for diverse casting. Numenor was a maritime empire with overseas colonies and trading posts in the south, that is, in Harad, and the Far East. As such, we would expect their island population and much of the rest of their empire to be ethnically diverse, for that is the way of all empires. The imperial core provides a great deal of economic opportunity, and thus subject peoples from the imperial periphery migrate to the core in large numbers, seeking to pursue those opportunities. Over time, many of them rise to positions of high station in the imperial system. If we assume that Numenor functioned like any real human imperial system, and there's no reason for us to assume otherwise, given the way Tolkien realistically depicted other human societies in his work, then we would expect a large Numenorian lower class of Haradrim, Kondian, Runish, and other dark-skinned folk living in the island's cities. And over time, a fair proportion of those folk would achieve middle-class or even upper-class status as they accumulated more wealth and influence. Thus, from both the top of society and from the bottom, a racially diverse population for the Numenorians makes total sense, and it is to the Rings of Power's credit that they took such care with attention to this detail. But all of that deals only with the race of men. Middle-earth is home to many other creatures, dwarves, elves, and hobbits, and we see racially diverse casting for them as well. Even if we grant that the casting choices for human characters make sense, that doesn't mean it makes sense for the non-human characters. So, is there anything in Tolkien's lore to support the way Rings of Power handles them? Let's consider Harfoots, the early nomadic hobbit society we see in the Rings of Power. This one can be buttoned up pretty quickly. Harfoots are one of the 3 breeds of hobbits described thusly in the prologue to The Lord of the Rings in the opening section called Concerning Hobbits. Quote, "The Harfoots were browner of skin, smaller and shorter, and they were beardless and bootless. Their hands and feet were neat and nimble, and they preferred highlands and hillsides." Unquote. Now, given that description, straight from Tolkien's pen, we would expect Hobbit society in general, and Harfoots in particular, to display a range of skin colors, or what we today think of as ethnicities. And that is exactly what the Rings of Power shows us. Now, the case for diverse casting of dwarves and elves requires a bit more extrapolation, a bit of reading between the lines and paying attention to things Tolkien did not explicitly rule out. So I put this part of my argument at the end because I know that for some viewers it will be the least convincing. The reasons for that tie into deeper philosophical questions about the valid ways of interpreting a text. Some people approach a text with a pseudo-fundamentalist mindset, which holds that strict literalism is the only valid way to engage with it. Under this framework, the words on the page mean only what they say and nothing more. Other people interpret texts more liberally, not only making room for multiple meanings and symbolism or allegory, but actually going out of their way to find them. And under this framework, the meaning of a text is not necessarily straightforward, and different perspectives on it can all have valid interpretations. Now, I fall more in the second camp than the first one. So for me, making a case for diverse casting of dwarves and elves by referencing Tolkien's texts is pretty easy. But I know that for fans of the first camp, what I am about to say might be a harder sell. I am at peace with that, but I hope that those in the first camp can at least see where I'm coming from, whether they agree with my reasoning or not. Dwarves are the easiest case to extrapolate from. In Tolkien's lore, dwarves were created by Aule, one of the Valar, under a mountain somewhere in Middle-earth. Aule had grown impatient, waiting for the awakening of elves and men, so he made for himself a group of beings to whom he could pass along his knowledge and wisdom. But because he lacked the spark of divinity necessary to create true life, it fell to Eru Ilúvatar, that is to say, to God, to come along and breathe true life into Aule's sub-creations. You can read the story of Aule's making of the dwarves in the Silmarillion, under the section titled Of Aule and Yavanna. The key parts of the story for our purposes are its location, in a hall under the mountains, and its products, 7 clans of dwarves. It's not too much of a stretch to assume that Aule crafted the 7 fathers of the dwarves from stone, and stone comes in many colors, not just white. Whether Aule used stone or not, the fact that he made 7 fathers who spawned 7 clans implies that he might have made each of them visually distinct from the others, the better to tell them apart. Thus, it is a valid extrapolation from the text to make each clan of dwarves visually distinct on screen by using actors of different ethnicities to represent them. And those who think this argument wouldn't apply to Khazad-dûm, the home of Durin's clan, the Longbeards, should be reminded that 2 other clans of dwarves, the Firebeards and the Broadbeams, fled the Blue Mountains early in the Second Age to become part of Khazad-dûm. Thus, by the time of the first season of The Rings of Power, we would expect to see a multi-ethnic population of dwarves dwelling in the Great Mountain Kingdom, which is exactly what we do see. Elven racial diversity barely requires any more extrapolation than dwarves. Tolkien divided his elves up into many clans, just as he did with dwarves, hobbits, and men. A big part of the story of the First Age of Middle-earth, which precedes the events of the Rings of Power, is the squabbling and warfare between the many elven clans. It took a great leader, Fingolfin, to unite the elven clans of Beleriand into common cause against the Dark Lord Morgoth. Although Tolkien doesn't explicitly write anywhere that different clans of elves had different clan-specific skin colors, it is not an unjustifiable choice for a visual adaptation to make, as with dwarves. It would help viewers keep track of which elves were from which clan, should the subject become relevant to the story later on down the road. We are told several times in The Rings of Power that the elf Erondir, played by Puerto Rican actor Ismael Cruz Cordova, is from Beleriand. We could therefore extrapolate that his clan of elves, perhaps the Minyar or the Tatyar, the first two elven clans to settle Beleriand, all shared his ethnicity. There's a hint that this might be the route the show took in Episode 4, The Great Wave, when Adar asks Erondir where he was born. When Erondir answers Beleriand, Adar inquires further, by the mouth of the river? This indicates that there is something about Erondir's appearance that tips Adar off to his place of origin, since they have not yet spoken. This is probably an Easter egg referring to the river Sirion, which divided Beleriand into eastern and western halves, and it could be a hint that within the Rings of Power's continuity, all or most of the elves who settled the lands around the mouth of the Sirion River shared Erondir's ethnicity. Whatever the case, it does not take much headcanon or fan fiction to get from Tolkien's text to racially diverse casting for dwarves or elves in a visual adaptation, and it takes no headcanon or fan fiction in the case of men and hobbits. Now, I think any humane, kind-hearted reading of The Lord of the Rings, the Silmarillion, and other parts of Tolkien's legendarium easily supports the kind of casting choices we see in The Rings of Power. And such choices are certainly in the spirit of Tolkien's great tale, where folk from many races banded together in a common cause against a terrible evil. As Season 2 of The Rings of Power draws near, I hope that awful takes on its supposed wokeness or its alleged betrayal of Tolkien's lore won't get the same kind of algorithmic boost that they did during Season 1. Perhaps that hope is in vain, but hope is never mere, even when it is meager. And my little channel will be here, holding out that hope. If you liked what you saw here, I'd really appreciate a like and a subscription and some comments down below, for engagement is our Anduril in the war against the Dark Lord Algorithm, and he is a mighty foe indeed. Thanks for watching. Until next time, remember that what's best in life is to crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and engage in discourse with their women. Shanti, Salam, Shalom.